We've got a really incredible session lined up for you now. It's going to start with a 20-minute keynote speech by someone incredibly special, and then is going to be followed up with a panel hosted by CogX's very own Anushka Sharma, who is head of partnerships, but also is the founder of space tech company Naaut. So now it is my completely great honor and pleasure to introduce one of my personal heroes, who last time I heard him speak reduced the entire board of Unilever to tears. So without further ado, Lord Martin Rees.
Okay, yes. Thank you, Sarah. Yes. Yeah. Thank you for no tears today. Yeah. But I'm going to start with a bit of history. This is Trinity College where I work, and this place has looked the same for 400 years. And the best student we ever had was this chap here, Isaac Newton. And Isaac Newton must have thought about space, because this is a famous picture from his book, The Principia. And it shows, you could see cannonballs being fired from a mountaintop, and if they're fired fast enough, then the Earth curves away underneath the trajectory as fast as the trajectory curves, so they go into orbit. And this is, I think, still the best way to explain to students the nature of orbital flight. And he calculated that you have to fire your cannonball at 18,000 miles an hour, far beyond, of course, what could be done by the cannon of his time. And again, as everyone knows, it wasn't until 1957 that the first man-made object, Sputnik 1, went into Earth's orbit. Followed very quickly by some Russian dogs, and then 4 years after that by the first astronaut to orbit the Earth, Yuri Gagarin. Gagarin actually came to London after this and was mobbed by huge crowds, but Mr. Macmillan, who was the Prime Minister at that time, was a cynical man, and he said the crowds would have been twice as big if they'd sent the dog. Yeah. Well, anyway, this was a great exploit, and it was followed by the first woman in space. And then, of course, 8 years after Gagarin, the famous moon landings, Neil Armstrong's one small step on the moon. And I treasure this picture, signed for me a few years ago by 7 of the Apollo astronauts. Now, I'm old enough to remember this event. I suspect that some in the audience, but most here can't. But what is remarkable is that at the time, this was an exciting event, and most of us would have expected that within a decade or so, there would have been footprints on Mars. In other words, long before today. But that didn't happen because the Apollo program was funded at huge expense for superpower rivalry reasons. 4% of the US federal budget was given to NASA for this program, as against 0.6% now. So once the race to the moon was won, there was no motive to continue this type of exploration. So since that time, as you know, hundreds of people have been into orbit, mainly just in the International Space Station. And it's rather odd, really, because I'm old enough to have thought of this as a futuristic event, whereas to my students today, it's an ancient historical event. They know the Egyptians built pyramids, they know the Americans landed a man on the moon, but these both seem ancient exploits motivated by rather strange national goals. That's the way it's looked at. And of course, we have had people going to space in the shuttle, but it's not very inspiring. And the shuttle has really only made the news when something goes wrong, when the loo doesn't work, or when Chris Hadfield does stunts like singing and playing his guitar up there. You know, it doesn't really justify the 12-figure expenditure on the space station and the shuttle. But of course, unmanned space exploration has hugely changed our understanding and our lives. We know that planets have been explored by unmanned probes, Mars, Saturn, etc. And amazingly, you remember that a probe has gone out beyond Pluto and sent back pictures of these strange worlds. And Pluto is 20,000 times further away than the Moon. And the transmitter had about 10 watts of power. And the other amazing thing is that those transmitters were designed in the 1990s, because it takes about 5 years or more to design and build a spacecraft, and it took more than 10 years to get there. And if you think how our mobile phones have improved in the last 15 years, just think how much better we could do today in sending miniaturized probes to explore the outer solar system. And one of my firm predictions is that there will be huge swarms of these tiny probes going out to study and beam back pictures of all the moons of our solar system and all the planets. That'll be very exciting. And of course, as we all know, we depend on space every day for sat-nav, for communications, and for environmental monitoring and weather forecasting. We depend on this. But what about the case for manned spaceflight? That's what I'm going to spend most of my time doing in this talk. But just a small digression about myself. I mean, I'm a space scientist, but I've become interested in the last decade in technology and its opportunities and its risks. I wrote a book about 15 years ago called Our Final Century, which is trying to explore what the risks were of the misuse of technologies. Nuclear, of course, but also bio, cyber, and AI. The American edition of this was retitled to Our Final Hour. Americans like instant gratification and the reverse. But I wrote a more recent book, which is on sale in a bookshop here, which is called On the Future, rather pretentious title, but this is really looking ahead in a more measured way about the exciting developments that we can expect in all these new technologies, but the downsides that occur. And the book discusses all of these things. I discuss the collective threats that humanity is posing to the climate and biodiversity, and of course the risk for misuse of advanced technology. Just one point, of course, one of the most exciting developments in the last few years is in AI, machine learning, and those sort of things. You've all heard about the Deep Minds projects and AlphaGo, X, etc., and what can be done because of the huge speed of computers. And this, of course, involves possible risks if they are misdirected, and also allows machines to take over much kind of work. And in my book, although not now, I discuss the implications of the redeployment of labor. But there's a debate about the extent to which machines will ever become like humans. If they do become like humans, then of course we have to worry about issues like, do we have to worry about their feelings? We feel we have an obligation to ensure that other human beings and even other animals fulfill their potential. So should we then have to start worrying about whether robots are underemployed or bored? That's going to be a real question. And of course, the downside is that we may have to worry about whether the machine will get out of its box, get access to the Internet of Things, and if we're not careful, perhaps try to fulfill goals which are misaligned with the goals of humans. This is a big issue, and one of the world experts on this is Stuart Russell, who's speaking somewhere elsewhere at this meeting during this week. So that's an issue. People differ in how rapidly they think machines will actually become rather like humans in their general intelligence. The creator of the Baxter robots and Roomba vacuum cleaner, he thinks it'll be a long time before we have to worry more about artificial intelligence than about real stupidity. But there are other people who are far more gung-ho about this potential. And extreme among them is this chap here. This is Ray Kurzweil, who now works for Google. And he wrote a book quite a long time ago, actually, called The Age of Spiritual Machines. And this is really about the idea that machines will achieve superhuman capacity, and then they will design even better ones. We get to the so-called singularity, and humans will be able to sort of download their brains from flesh and blood into some machine. In old-style spiritualist parlance, they would go over to the other side. Well, he talks about this with a straight face, as though this may happen, but he's already quite old. He's in his 60s, and he's worried this may not happen in his lifetime. And so he's one of those people who has arranged to have his body frozen in liquid nitrogen when he dies, to be revived when this nirvana of being able to share this common consciousness is revived. And good luck to him. Incidentally, I was surprised to find that 3 of my academic colleagues had signed up for this so-called cryonic treatment. In fact, 2 have paid the full whack, about $80,000. A third, the cut price option of just having his head frozen. I was glad that these are all from Oxford, not from my university. Which I told them I'd rather end my days in an English churchyard than an American refrigerator, which is where they're going to end up. Well, that's just a digression into other themes from my book. But let me now go back to some of the themes stemming from this wonderful image. What is the future of manned spaceflight? I think the practical case is getting weaker and weaker all the time as robots get more capable. At the moment, we have the Curiosity rover and its successors trundling over the surface of Mars, and they will probably miss something which a human geologist would find. But on the other hand, we will soon have robots which are just as adept as a human observer, and the case for sending people will be less, and it will, of course, become very much cheaper. So I personally don't see that there will be a case for publicly funded astronauts in the mold of the Apollo program and the shuttle. Indeed, if I was an American, I wouldn't support taxpayers' money going on NASA's manned program. And I certainly hope that Europe doesn't go in for a serious manned program through ESA. But having said that, I would support private enterprise efforts like those being carried out by SpaceX, that's Elon Musk's company, and Blue Origin, which is Jeff Bezos' company. The reason I support that is that they can adopt Silicon Valley techniques, and they can also adopt a more risky profile than NASA or ESA could impose on publicly funded civilians. You remember that the space shuttle was launched 135 times. There were 2 catastrophic crashes. Each one was a national trauma in America. But test pilots and the kind of people who hang glide in Yosemite or go around the world in balloons and that sort of thing, they're prepared to accept a 2% failure rate, a 2% risk. The mistake that NASA made was saying it was safe and sending a woman school teacher up and all that. It should have been presented not as space tourism, but as space adventure. And that's the way that it should be presented by Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. I think, incidentally, that Richard Branson, who of course isn't anywhere near putting people into orbit, is making a mistake using the phrase space tourism. because that implies it's routine and there will be a trauma if there's an accident. It's got to be something which is done by people prepared to accept high risks. And I think that will happen. Already we know that there are people who have paid up front to go into orbit, and a Japanese billionaire has paid money for him and a few friends to go round the backside of the moon and back. It's a 5-day journey. There's also been talk, although less seriously perhaps, of people going round the backside of Mars and back. That's about 500 days. It will not be crazy, but it will be a rather boring journey and rather dangerous. So it is said that the ideal crew would be a middle-aged couple, happy to be cooped up together and old enough they don't care about radiation doses. So that's all right. But I want to end up being slightly more serious about manned spaceflight, because I think that through the efforts of Musk and Bezos, there will be people on Mars within the next 50 years. Privately funded risk takers. People in the mold of, say, Sir Ranulph Fiennes, who dragged a sledge across the Antarctic. There'll be people like that. And I think we should cheer them on. And the reason we should cheer them on is that I think they will be even cosmically important. So let me finish by explaining why this is so. Of course, as we know, and as I discuss in the rest of my book, there are going to be huge developments in the next 50 years in robotics, cyborg techniques, and in genetic modification to enhance and change human physiology. That's going to happen. But it's going to be pretty heavily regulated. But those people on Mars, they'll be out of reach of the regulators, and they'll be in an environment to which they're badly adapted. We're adapted to the Earth, not to Mars. So they will have every opportunity and every incentive to adapt themselves to this alien environment. And they will quite soon, indeed within a century or so, become a new species probably. And they may, as Kurzweil predicts, become electronic rather than flesh and blood. If that's the case, then they may not need an atmosphere anymore. They may prefer zero-G, so they will go away from their planet. And if they're near immortal, then interstellar journeys are not daunting for them. So this could be the launch of a new post-human era. And before finishing on that, let me go back and emphasize that although I'm an enthusiast for manned missions to Mars for adventurers, I think I disagree strongly with Elon Musk and my ex-colleague Stephen Hawking, in that I think it's a dangerous delusion to think there'd be ever mass emigration to Mars. We've got to deal with the world's problems here on Earth. Dealing with climate change here is hard, but it's a doddle compared to terraforming Mars and making Mars habitable. So Mars is a place for adventurers. There's no planet B for ordinary risk-averse people. We've got to cherish our earthly home. But just finally, let me just make a statement as an astronomer. Yes, these are the pictures I should have shown earlier. Yeah. But I wanted to finish with this. This is a familiar picture, a time chart showing how it's taken about 4 billion years for humans to evolve by Darwinian selection from the primordial slime. Now, unless you live in Kentucky or parts of the Muslim world, you're familiar with this, but many people who are familiar with this nonetheless somehow think that we humans are the culmination, the end. No astronomer can think that, because although this has taken 4 billion years, the Earth is less than halfway through its life. It'll be another 6 billion years before the sun dies. And the universe may go on forever, And to quote Woody Allen, eternity is very long, especially towards the end. So we're probably not even at the halfway stage of cosmic evolution. And indeed, cosmic evolution in future will be a sort of secular intelligent design, happening much faster than Darwinian selection, in centuries, not hundreds of centuries. So this future evolution will be very fast, and so, but in this perspective, my final thought is that this present century is crucial, because even in a concertina perspective, stretching billions of years into the past and billions of years into the future, this is crucial because first, it's the first century of one species, ours, has the future of the planet in its hands and can determine the future fate, and it may also see the transition from being an entirely Earth-based to being a spacefaring species, and also from being a solely flesh and blood a species to being partly electronic. So with those thoughts, let me conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And Lord Rees is going to be joining us for our panel. So I'd like to invite Anushka and the rest of the panelists to the stage. Thank you very much.
Okay. Oh, sorry. This way. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I feel like we have a lot to discuss. It's great to see so many people from the wider space community joining us at an AI and emerging technology conference here in King's Cross. And it's wonderful to bring a panel together who share so much of the diversity of the facets of the space sector. And I'd like to start, because they're right next to me, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. And I'm going to ask James to go first.
Thanks, Nush. My name's James Parr, and I am CEO of Trillium Technologies, and we run AI and space research.
Jannicke.
I'm Jannicke Mikkelsen. I am the producer and technical director of what's called the People's Moon. It's the Apollo 11 50th anniversary global celebration, and work for the Buzz Aldrin Family Foundation.
My name is Rafael Jordá. I am the CEO and founder of Open Cosmos. We enable access to space to help each one of you actually to target solving the world's biggest challenges.
And I think we all know Lord Rees. Who's told me I can call him Martin? Mm-hmm. Would you like to say some words?
Okay, well, I'm Martin Rees, and I'm a professor at Cambridge University, but I diversify into thinking about science policy and helping to set up a centre in Cambridge to study, in particular, extreme technological and environmental risks.
So we wanted to frame the conversation today around future space. We've talked about manned missions and future robotic missions and missions that are robotic that are already on the surface of the Moon and Mars already. I think it's really interesting to bring together science communicators and innovators and new space entrepreneurs such as Raf, who has come out of Entrepreneur First. And Raf, tell me about how you're finding your place in the space sector as a startup from London, you were born in Spain, and you are now in the supply chain dealing with players like SpaceX, where you're launching and designing satellites from scratch. How has that been for you?
Well, it's been a hell of a roller coaster over the last 3 years and a half since I founded the company. To give you an idea, what we are trying is to enable satellites to be put into orbit so we can gather global data sets or provide communication services, right? The first satellite we delivered in 6 months. So for those of you that are working in the computer industry, probably that's a long time. For the satellite industry, that's really short. Usually satellites take several years to be put into orbit. What we want is to enable this technology to be used as a tool. So what we've done is making sure that it's simple and useful to each one of you. So you can incorporate your technologies, deliver your data sets, and then exploit them, understand through them how that information is extracted and used.
I really like that because you're creating a diversity of data sets. And at this point, this is where I want to bring in James, and there's this phrase we've used together, and it's mission control Earth. And we're at a point now where we have an abundance of data from satellites. You're now enabling, Raf, individuals and companies to have access to their own data sets. Mm-hmm. How can we use this for mission control Earth and really help tackle this climate crisis that Martin mentioned earlier on? And how can we empower ourselves as people aligning to the UN Sustainable Development Goals here at the conference?
Raf's, his company's called Open Cosmos, and we met about 3 years ago, and he's like, my name's Open Cosmos. I was like, that's so good. That's the perfect, it's like one of those things where, the C parts, and I realized how good it was, and we were chatting over lunch just about this new transition that's happening, this lag in the space community where, satellites are designed 15, 20 years ago, and by the time they're launched, technologies have moved on, as Lord Rees mentioned. We're now entering into an era where instead of sending these big $500 million or $1 billion spacecraft, we can now think about sending swarms, much cheaper, much more disposable, but much easier to do and get going. And also, instead of collecting, a few megabytes, they're collecting it in pristine 8K, amazing data. And this is, I don't think people quite understand the transition in data collection which is happening right now. And if you talk to ML folks and about using space data, and you say, look, there are 50 years of space data, and they're like, well, really the last 5, that's where the good stuff is. And it's true, because really it's this capacity to look at the Earth in high resolution, which is where the exciting change is. And what that means, and you mentioned this concept of emission control for Earth. This has been on the to-do list of space agencies for about 10 years. And we're lucky enough to work with the big ones, and I know that, and I've seen mission control go on a post-it note, and everyone said, how do we do this? And we haven't been able to, because the technology hasn't been there. And this amazing moment we're in with companies like Open Cosmos, this amazing ability to really gather petabytes, this petabyte era of data collection, plus ML, this is a magic moment. This is where everything changes. And so suddenly we have the ability to start thinking about how we could use data and AI to manage our planet in a way we haven't ever been able to before.
I think it's great. I've just spotted Charlie Muirhead, the founder of Cognition X, one of the key leading figures of bringing us all here today. And I think something I spoke to Charlie about in bringing space to the conference this year is because we truly are at an inflection point now where we need to drive talent and bring focused minds who are really working on big data, working with artificial intelligence and machine learning. I'm looking out because you as an audience reflect the talent we're looking to scale for the frontier that we want to develop in the world. And Jannicke, you're doing a lot of work in communicating to the wider community and really inspiring the youth. What can we enable these players in the room today to help us to drive that initiative forward? How can we do that?
So basically my role as a space communicator is that it's good with the engineers and the scientists, but they're preaching to the space community. We need them to preach locally and get everybody on board so we don't have fake news or climate deniers or science deniers or flat earthers or the list goes on. We are leading the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11. And everybody looks at the moon and dreams. I mean, obviously, I'm not old enough to remember the moon landing, but I believe the moon landing took place. There's too much evidence for that. But what we are doing is we're inviting everybody around the globe to submit a picture and a little message of what the moon means to them and what their impossible dream is, and become part of a time capsule, which will live permanently at the Kennedy Space Center in the form of a photo mosaic. So that we have a little time capsule, not a little, it's going to be pretty large, of dreams of people and how the moon landing has inspired people for generations to dream and become a better version of themselves. We have submissions from Tanzania, we have submissions from China, we have submissions from the North Pole, we have submissions from, absolutely the most amazing places, and reaching out to schools and educating the children from the age of 5 and 6 and really creating space hubs.
It's actually, I'm going to be quite cheeky because we have a brilliant tech audience in front of us all, and Raf, you're scaling your company, you're scaling your startup. We want to see and help and your companies grow now as space sector activists. And the talent that you're going to train and scale and grow over the next 10 years is really going to help us when the funnel for income from VCs and the finance really starts to scale. The space sector is the players, like Martin mentioned, of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, really now providing a transportation system. Martin, what do you see as the biggest outlier that's going to help enable that the most for this community and all of us that are looking forward to the future?
Well, I'd say that in the short run, as has been mentioned, miniature, cheap satellites are very important. We know that you can launch about 100 shoebox-sized satellites. A company called Planet Lab has done this, and their mantra is observing every tree in the world every day. And you can monitor the whole Earth in that sort of way, a very useful technique. That's just one example. And of course, we've heard slightly controversially about the idea of thousands of low-flying satellites in order to give internet to middle of Africa, where otherwise they won't get it. So the point is that space is useful in a way that can involve players who don't need to have to put in billions of pounds. It can be done by small-scale people. And, of course, launching is getting cheaper as well, with reusable first stages and all that. So, and my near-term vision is that. The longer-term vision, of course, I've talked about people on Mars, but just to say another thought that strikes me when we realize it's 50 years since Apollo, it's 50 years since we had the iconic image of the Earth and the Moon, the Earth's fragile biosphere contrasting with the sterile moonscape where the astronauts place their footprints. And I think that if we look 50 years ahead, a reasonable goal will be to have another equally iconic image, which will be an image of an Earth-like planet orbiting another star. One of the most exciting things in astronomy, as people may know, is that we now realize that most of the stars in the sky are orbited by retinues of planets, just as the Sun is orbited by the Earth and the other familiar planets. These are very, very faint, and we can't even see them at all, really. We see their effect only indirectly. But by 2068, I can imagine we will have robotic fabricators that have made huge telescopes in space that can actually get an image of these other worlds. And that will be a real mind-blowing expansion of our scale. And so looking 50 years ahead, I think that'll be something which we can aspire towards.
That's really awesome. In fact, I'm going to jump to James, because you kind of sit in the middle of that 50-year mission and what Martin has just described, because you work with space scientists and AI specialists and kind of bring this innovative magic together. And I believe you've helped to identify exoplanets as results of projects that you've... Can you tell us all about that?
Yeah, it's a big subject. Yeah, we've done work using AI to detect exoplanets, the test data, the NASA spacecraft. And what's exciting about that is if you are an exoplanet hunter, up until now, the data you've been looking at has really been a postage stamp. That's what Kepler, which was the previous spacecraft, could look at. And the phenomenal thing about TESS is it's doing 89% of the sky. And so our ability to see and really detect exoplanets, we're just hitting a exponential curve on that. So it's a really amazing time. And of course, what's exciting about that is that, of course, there's the hunt for a terrestrial-like planet in the Goldilocks zone, which is not too hot, not too cold. I feel like Lord Rees should be saying this, but but we are on the verge of being able to see biohints, which are essentially fluctuations potentially in the spectra of these exoplanets. This will come with the next generation of megascopes, but AI is going to be crucial in actually starting to detect those biohints. And again, it's an example of AI in scientific workflows, and I think this is again talking about the kind of transition that we're going through. The way that AI is being established through these workflows is the kind of the quantum shift that is happening, that again is perhaps we're not quite aware of, or perhaps isn't quite as dramatic as seeing self-driving cars. But the thing is, you can take a complex scientific workflow that takes years of work, and AI can start to crunch that and not only get it faster but better and cheaper, and put it in the CubeSat. And this is where it's getting really exciting, and it's almost like if I said to you, hey, wouldn't it be great to be able to predict the future? You go, yeah, that would be cool, but it's not true. Well, it is, because we predict the future all the time with the weather. Like the fact we're in this tunnel, perhaps probably not the best example, but we now have amazing weather forecasts, and the value to our society of being able to predict the weather 2, 3, 4, 5 days in advance has incredible economic value, which we've benefited from. AI is going to allow that for everything. And this is the extraordinary thing about AI, is its predictive capacity. If you have the data, you can start to predict things with a very high degree of accuracy. And so we'll actually start to be able to predict the future. And this means better decisions about the way we run and organize our societies. And I was thinking, I wore my Occupy Mars t-shirt today, because of course it's a space conference. But really, I want a t-shirt that says data, not dogma, because that's the era we should be in. We should be using data to make decisions, not dogma. We've had too much dogma. We need to get to this new era. And fortunately, like the end of a movie, AI is here to save us. I believe it's not the Terminator. It's a good thing. So.
I mean, we've had people shutting down London, and Extinction Rebellion really shouting about we've got 10 years, and all of the best space scientists and problem solvers in this room today. You're charged with this big challenge, and what would be the purpose of all this brilliant innovation if we weren't applying it to make our planet a better place, but also using that for the better of space exploration for all of our human and post-human era goals, as Lord Rees mentioned. Jannicke, what do you see, having worked with the Buzz Aldrin Family Foundation, you've had a chance to really kind of get under the, I don't want to put you on the spot, but what do you see as a family who've been through the last 50 years of seeing where we've taken those initial steps on the moon? NASA and private organizations like SpaceX are really coming together. We were talking the other day, and we were talking about
this
government.
is a really big subject.
It's a big subject.
So we deal with private companies, and we also deal with government companies, and we deal with politics a lot, but also we deal with educational programs, and they're all separately, and also within NASA, the departments don't speak to each other, which is a problem. Now, the thing that I want the UK to be a leading space nation. We have the knowledge and we have the power to do it. The thing is that, okay, I don't want to say a household politician, an American household name politician, I was talking to him and he goes, I don't understand why we should invest in the space program. I don't know why we should invest in exploration and why we should invest in development for space. And I was like, well, do you have a smartphone? He goes, yes. Do you use the internet? Yes. Do you use the GPS on it? Yes. And I was like, well, satellites. and he goes, I don't understand. And I go, well, how do you think they got up there? Rockets. Let's just say, I think education is really something we need to work on, and education the general audience of how important space is. And in the UK, I think we are more than ripe and ready to start developing a huge space nation that can lead the future.
Raf, how are you finding your place in the space network? Because you sit, like me, in between tech as well. How has that challenge been for you as you now come to audiences like this and speak to a deep tech audience and also see the space sector, as challenging as that can be sometimes? How do you find it?
Many times when I try to explain what is happening right now in the space sector, I actually, rather than going 50 years ahead, I go 50 years back. So think about the computer industry 50 years ago. A computer was probably as big as this space, right? Was really expensive. Only a few people could use it. Was affordable. Then some people came and made them small and affordable. They put it into the hands of the people. They started to be used. What's next? We have tons of applications, right? That's what's happening right now in the space industry. So we are miniaturizing this technology to make it affordable, to democratize it, and to make it accessible to all of you as a tool. As a result of that, I'm really excited about the work that James and other companies in this field are doing. There's so many problems to solve that now we have to focus on the use of this technology through applications that solve problems regarding food supply chain, weather, climate crisis. There are a number of global sustainable development challenges that we need to target And many of them can be addressed thanks to the data and global understanding that we achieve through satellites.
I mean, just to put that in perspective, your phone has a processing chip which is 13 million times faster than the Saturn V rockets.
That's right.
Think about the opportunities they could have had.
So that's the sort of improvement of technology that we are bringing and making available. The space industry has traditionally been very risk-adverse, right? We need to manage risk in a different way. We need to make sure that actually these innovations that are coming are available to all of you to use.
Lord Rees, on your photo, was there, I can't remember the astronaut,
yes.
The one who said, "Look at this, you son of a," famously looked at the whole Earth from space.
Yeah, yeah.
And really
That was Anders, I think, wasn't
yes,
it?
it was,
Yep.
yes.
Yes.
And this idea that, we are, we have this, pixel in the infinite cosmos, and famously Carl Sagan turned the Voyager 1 around
Yes.
and looked at
Right.
the Earth from
The pale blue dot.
That's right. And just the one thing about space is it really puts things into perspective about how insignificant we are, and also how fragile this little spaceship we are, traveling through the infinite cosmos. Again, I feel like I should be giving. But and I think this is the thing about space too, is it reminds us about our place in the universe. It sort of suddenly makes us all together, and our common rivalries. We should really put them apart and start working together to manage this life support system, because we're really screwing it up, and we haven't got long.
Well, me and Martin had a quick discussion about private versus government funding. And there's two ways that the UK can become a leading space nation. One is government and tax dollars. The other one is that we as individuals or as citizens start making industries for space and start actually getting money for space. Those are the two ways we can do it.
Yeah, I mean, I can add to that. I think first on big data, I mean, that could not be handled at all without present-day computers. In astronomy, the Gaia European spacecraft got data on 1.7 billion stars. You can't look at that without having a computer. And this is happening in all fields of science now. And also another thing is that we need computers to do simulations when we can't do experiments. I mean, obviously in astronomy we can't do real experiments. We can only do simulations of galaxies crashing together, etc. But in many other fields of science, like design of drugs, looking for a high-temperature superconductor, etc., it's probably going to be better to compute zillions of options rather than do the experiments. So computers are going to, through their speed, allow all these things to happen. And the speed, of course, has allowed things like machine translations and things like that. Machines learn just by going through a lot. They look at billions of pages of EU documents. They never get bored in order to learn to translate, and they can handle huge bodies of data. And to give another example, the Chinese will be able to have a planned economy of a kind that Marx could only dream of, simply because they can now access and handle all the data that's needed. So they are really transformative.
I think we're at a really interesting point, looking at all of this big data, coming up with answers. We have lots of questions and things we still need to solve. There are lots of grand challenges that are being set up. There are people who are building systems in full circle systems, so completely sustainable off-the-grid models. How can we encourage more people to bring people together in an innovative way, or a hackathon way, or in unusual ways to really tap into talent? I know, Raf, we've met at a hackathon before, and James, you've judged many hackathons. How do we encourage more people to get involved?
I think that the problem definition is a really important thing. Like being able to shape a question which isn't too hard, but is also worth the jump. If you look at Kennedy's speech, 1962, to land a human being on the moon and return safely to Earth in 8 years, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. It's almost the perfect, you listen to that and go, wow, that is the perfect challenge definition language. And must have been informed by people who really knew their stuff, because it was possible. It turned out they did it. So I think that it's always the thing which is hard to invest in, is asking really, really good questions. Like, for example, we could say, hey, let's clean up plastic from the oceans. That's a really big problem, and actually it's too hard for us to get our arms around. But, for example, using AI to predict the movement of currents and the way that the gyros work, and perhaps developing some open cosmos CubeSats with the right detection equipment, suddenly you can break it down into components. And I think the art and science of grand challenges is this problem decomposition. And at the moment, I think that's the way to do it. So that's my take.
Mm-hmm. If I was to stimulate people actually trying to help solve challenges, what I would do is look at the goals, the Sustainable Development Goals. Are you working one way or another into trying to solve some of these issues? If you are not, it's likely that you are working on the wrong thing, right? So figure out what's the problem that you want to solve, and be aware that today you have access to global data thanks to these technologies, and that potentially the data set that you need to figure out the solution to some of those, it's already available to you, or we can make it available to you.
Can I build on that a little bit? Because the interesting thing about it is it's not always. Is that actually some of these grand challenges, when you start, you can write the challenge and then you go to getting the data, and it's on PDFs. Or it's in a format which is really hard to integrate or do data fusion on. And this is the other thing, which is, again, a sort of grand challenge in itself, is just to get the world's data ready for these big things that we want to do.
There's a great, Charlie.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
I would take the assumption that everybody here is interested in this topic. And I would love to know, each individually, what this audience could do to progress each of your current focused piece of work. Because I would say there's a lot of people here who, whether they volunteer or they might be looking for a job or they might be looking to invest, what do each of you guys need to progress what you're doing right now?
Happy to start. There are many things we need. I'm going to focus on three. Number one, we are growing and we are recruiting. We need world talent to be able to help achieve our vision. We need software engineers, electronic engineers, people that can help us actually democratize the technology much faster. Number two, we need people who really have spotted a problem, a challenge to solve, and know the data set that they need. If they come to us with that question, can you provide me infrared imaging over this area? Can you provide me IoT data from these sensors on the ground that I have over there? Then we can put the solution forward. And number three, if you have a technology that you think can be used in a space environment, whether it is to improve the current technologies that are already available or just a sensor that you want to test, also come to us, because we want to get them flying as soon as possible.
James, do you want to go?
Well, thank you, Charlie. I mean, I think I'm going to answer it in a very specific way, and it sort of builds on what I was saying about challenge development. Is in the same way that the web created a whole host of new challenges, a few new job descriptions like web solutions architect, these things which didn't exist before the web. I think AI is producing a new nomenclature of jobs as well, and I think there's something about data. And challenges and people who understand the data set enough to craft a challenge and then drive it through the sandwich of data prep, algorithm development, and then deployment. And this journey that an AI problem goes on, we need people who have the ability to do that. And the sort of job doesn't exist yet, but if you're interested in being that person and learning how to do that and figuring it out, happy to chat.
I'm fully focused on the 50th anniversary. To quote JF Kennedy again, is that we must look at the past to inspire the future. So I want everybody in this room to go on thepeoplesmoon.com, write down your story, and submit your picture, and become part of the Apollo legacy and be part of that bank. Now we're celebrating in Times Square for the whole day. We're even going to drop the New Year's Eve ball, like it's going to be a big thing. And we're going to celebrate in Piccadilly.
Are you dropping the moon?
No, we're going to make it into the Earth. So it's Earthrise, and then and then Times Square becomes Tranquility Bay.
Nice.
But for the future, space isn't just for STEM. Space is for STEAM. We need to remember the artists because we need communicators. And we need legacy.
Yes.
How's the Flat Earth Society? Oh,
Yes. Well, as someone who works in university, I want to put in a plug for the fascination of blue skies research and the importance of blue skies research, because we all know about the Kennedy challenge in 1962, and that worked because throwing money at the problem was sufficient. 10 years after that, Nixon had the challenge of curing cancer in a similar way, model on that, and that didn't work. The reason there was that they didn't know enough basic science, and that was a problem that couldn't be tackled head-on. You need to understand more about cell biology and genetics and all that. So it stimulated some science, but many of the big challenges can't be tackled head-on. They've got to be the outcome of lots of piecemeal efforts and curiosity-driven research. So I think we've got to bear in mind we want some people to continue to be fascinated by science for its own sake, because that's going to be the way in which we can actually solve problems like curing cancer, etc., which we can't now. But nonetheless, I think it's the engineering and the application of science which is the biggest challenge, and I'm certainly not going to be an academic snob. I mean, when there are engineers in the audience, as there probably are now, I like to remind them of a cartoon they like, which shows two beavers looking up at a big hydroelectric dam. One beaver says to the other, "I didn't actually build it, but it's based on my idea." And I think as a modest blue sky scientist, I realize that what I do is trivial compared to the effort of making something that actually works.
I think that's wonderful. I think that's wonderful. I'm conscious of time and everyone wanting to get to different sessions, but I would love to know if anyone in the audience is already working in the space sector. Raise your hand. Fantastic. We've got some science communicators all in a row right there. Is anyone a dev in the audience that's looking to work on projects in the space sector at all? Ooh. Do we have any? Oh, we've got about 4. Do we have any data scientists? Amazing. And Charlie?
Wow, all your dreams are Does Amy have a question? We have a mic here, don't we?
Yes, do we have any questions from the audience? This is a great opportunity to involve you all.
Got a question there?
Anyone from the Flat Earth Society here?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm currently doing my PhD looking at artificial intelligence and clinical decision making, but is there any, have you got any openings for ethicists in the space community? Is that something you guys ever consider? Is it something you should be considering?
There is a lot of work happening bringing ethicists together. There is a big congress that's happening in Washington, D.C. in November. It's the International Astronautical Congress. It's happening in Washington, D.C. I'd love for you to come, talk to me afterwards. I'd love to get you the details of getting there, and really talking about missions that are landing or due to land on the surface of the moon in 2020 on Apollo 17 sites, I think is a wider conversation that we need to involve the general public in, and I'm not quite sure that that's being served specifically in the space sector. So I think this is the right time to get people together, and this has been a brilliant opportunity to bring people together.
Got another question here.
Hi, my name is Patrick. Question to you all. How far do you think we can, in the next 10 years, we can push automation or autonomous systems for spaceships? Can we do automated mining? Can we have 3D building, dome building machines on Mars, that kind of thing?
In 10 years?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's right on the edge.
Yeah.
I think probably we're looking more like the 15, 20-year time frame for that level of autonomy. Certainly, decision-making in terms of path optimization for rovers, traversing on the moon and swarm operations of rovers. But I think you'd still be having a human being making a decision every couple of minutes probably, or perhaps every, they take a coffee break and you still have humans in the loop. I think full autonomy, the sort of stuff you're talking about, is probably 15, 20 years away, I'd say. And then we were chatting about just the realities of the lag between the GPU technology that you'd need to have deployed in a high radiation environment. That hasn't been solved yet. And that is certainly a lag problem.
Yes, I think the first thing will be robots that can assemble large structures in Earth orbit, large telescope mirrors, solar energy collectors, etc. Things far bigger than could be launched in a single rocket. I'd have thought that could happen within 10 years.
One thing that is already happening in terms of automation, it's on the control of satellites and fleets of satellites. So you can't imagine when deploying constellations of hundreds of satellites, you need them to be behaving in an autonomous way, pointing in the right directions, getting solar panels pointing towards the direction where they get the power. All of that is something that we have already automated for our satellites, and that we are working at automatizing for full constellations and fleets of satellites as well.
I mean, if we are looking at regular space flights to Mars, we also need to mine the moon for natural resources such as water and helium-3 for rocket fuel. And those plans are being looked at seriously, but also it's an ethical question.
There is also one example that Fosters and Partners have done in looking at how to 3D print on the moon. They've done some research in that, using the regolith on the surface of the moon as the structure with inflated domes. But we're fast approaching the end of our time on stage here. We do have Meet the Speaker, so please come and join us at the top of the escalator, where I would love to ask you to join the rest of our panel for questions. Please, can you give us a massive round of applause for this epic panel? Thank you guys so much.